It's only been 10 years that the United States has been exporting liquefied natural gas, but today we are the largest exporter of LNG in the world.
We must never allow wishful thinking to color our analysis. And I think that's what happened.
The United States is the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas. And now the Trump administration is making a massive play to turn that into geopolitical leverage. The plan? Pour billions into rebuilding Venezuela's crumbling oil infrastructure, flood the market with cheap crude, and drive prices down to $50 a barrel.
And now the U.S. is basically telling them, we are not going to give you a license, treasury license to export oil from Venezuela. That means that the Chinese and the Russians do not have any incentives to invest anymore in Venezuela in oil and gas.
But it's complicated. China and Russia hold the largest reserve fields in Venezuela and are now being told they can't export from them. Private oil companies are weighing big opportunities against a country with a long history of seizing foreign assets. And global demand for electricity is surging, driven by AI and data centers. So, what happens to the global energy transition when the world's largest oil producer is doubling down on fossil fuels? And what does this mean for countries caught between cheap American crude and China's dominance in clean energy technology?
I think it's really important to recognize that even electrostates are still very dependent on hydrocarbons. So China remains the largest importer.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, the vision for U.S. energy strategy and how it fits into the future global energy mix. We're joined today by Dr. Carolyn Cassan, Associate Dean of the Graduate Program in Global Affairs at NYU's Center for Global Affairs, Robert McNally, founder of Rapid Energy Group and former White House energy advisor to President George W. Bush, and Dr. Francesco Monaldi, Director of the Latin America Energy Program at Rice University's Baker Institute. Moderating the conversation is Earl Carr, founder and CEO of CJPA Global Advisors, an adjunct instructor at NYU's Center for Global Affairs.
I cannot think of a better panel for this discussion. I'd like to start off first with you, Bob. We've seen massive energy change in the energy strategy of the U.S., moving away from the focus on climate goals towards a strategy of energy dominance through crude oil. Can you explain why is this happening and what is the primary goal of this crude power?
Great, Earl. Thank you. Great to be invited and delighted to be with towering experts, Carolyn Cassan and Francisco Monaldi. Focus is on drill, baby, drill, and the vivid Trump and Republican Congress changes to climate, environmental, and drilling policy. Like everything else that's going on, it's flamboyant, it's loud, it's a huge turnaround from the previous administration, et cetera, et cetera. But I would urge everybody to step back and cut through the din and realize that the shift that Earl just described is not just happening in the United States. The anomaly, in my view, is that starting shortly after the Paris Agreement, so 2015, 2016, certainly by 2020, and until very recently, it's not just the U.S., but the world has embraced this idea that we must and will quickly decarbonize, that climate change constitutes such a profound threat to the planet that we can and we will decarbonize both our transportation sectors, so electric vehicles and efficiency gains instead of gasoline, and then the power sector, renewables. It's not just activist governments, it's investors and think tanks and government forecasting agencies like the IEA embraced this not only as something we must do, but something that we will do. Just about everybody I know who puts out a public forecast, whether it's a government agency or an oil company or a think tank, they showed something extraordinary, that oil demand would stop growing in about 5 years. Same thing with natural gas. That's stunning. For those of us who study the history of energy transitions, the history of oil, and work with modeling, it's a shocking, marvelous departure to believe that somehow climate policies and fuel efficiency policies would be so strong as to bend the demand curve for oil and gas, which with coal was 80% of our energy use. We're skeptical. I'm setting aside whether we should do this. That's a separate question. We must never allow wishful thinking to color our analysis. And I think that's what happened. But we're moving out of it. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the energy shocks that delivered, political changes, inflation. It's not just the Trumpian United States. Look what's happening in Europe. The EU is walking back from its climate policies, including its EV mandates. The same thing. Canada, same thing. Even China is removing purchase subsidies for its electric vehicles. It doesn't mean that the world no longer cares about climate change. What it means is that in the midst of energy security, energy affordability, coming up the ladder of priorities, it means that we're having a more pragmatic and balanced approach to thinking about energy. It has to be all of the above, and it has to be based in a realistic sense about the costs and the timeframes of energy transitions. They are multi-decade affairs. And when they happen, it's usually because of private sector innovation that introduces new technologies. That's how we transition from 5,000 years on horses, from Moses to Harriet Tubman to cars. It wasn't because of a government peak horse policy in the late 1800s. It was purely private sector. And the idea that we could have a Paris Agreement and decide we need to go to net zero, and therefore we're just going to kill oil and gas demand with weak climate policies that governments were often unwilling to see through. To me, that was the strange thing, and we're emerging from that. So, Earl, I would say we're coming back to reality, really. And in that view, you see it in flamboyant depiction with President Trump, of course. It's happening less flamboyantly everywhere on the planet as well.
Thank you, Bob. From Moses to Harriet Tubman, I will remember that. Aldi, let me begin with you next. This energy strategy is deeply and fundamentally rooted in a hemisphere first approach, most notably seen in the U.S. action in Venezuela. How does bringing Venezuelan oil under control fit within the broader of regional dominance by the
Errol, and great to be here with Bob, Carolyn. Actions in Venezuela clearly constitute the most notable and aggressive action of the U.S. to reassert its influence or perhaps even dominance in the Western Hemisphere, well beyond Venezuela itself. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Panama, presidents and governments are much more willing to acquiesce to priorities in terms of migration, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of critical minerals. In terms of drug policy, their history, the U.S. for at least the last decade has been concerned about the influence of geopolitical rivals, in particular China, South America, have been trying to curb that influence, and that has become even more significant in this world of fragmentation of markets and geopolitical rivalries in terms of critical minerals and other resources. Bold action in Venezuela, the military action was extremely successful so far from the perspective of the objectives. And surprisingly, first, there was very little condemnation by Latin American countries compared to what you would have expected in the past. And opinion surveys show that Latin Americans, by and large, supported President Trump's action. I think frustrated with the effects of what was happening in Venezuela throughout the region, and of course also with drug trafficking and crime. Oil is not the only motivation, but it's a relevant part of the equation. In the short run, Venezuela is not very important for the world oil market because Venezuela produces less than 1 million barrels of oil, less than 1% of global supply, and it could add, say, in the next 2 to 3 years, perhaps 500,000, which is less than 0.5% in a relatively well-supplied market. But there are two other perspectives in which Venezuela is a much more relevant issue and player in terms of oil. The first is in the short term does play a significant role in the heavy oil market in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the and refineries in the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana have been geared to this type of oil. And because Mexico and Venezuela had been declining, was a scarcity of heavy oil because Canadian oil does get to the Gulf Coast, but not in the quantities that it should because the infrastructure is not there. Keystone XL was never built. This is a welcome development for refiners in that this is going to improve their margins. The most important and less talked about benefit, a scenario, going back to what Bob was talking about, a new scenario of the International Energy Agency in which the demand for oil continues to grow or stabilizes at levels that are similar to what we have today. There will be a potential shortage of supply in the next decade or so because of lack of investment that we have seen in the past few years. And that makes what happens in Venezuela and perhaps in Iran extremely important in those scenarios for energy security, not only of the US, but energy security of the world. Political stability in Venezuela, probably a transition to democracy, allow Venezuela to potentially increase 3 million barrels of oil per day of production. That will be very significant.
Thank you so much. Carolyn, I want to bring you in here. You think of Washington's energy strategy, which comes at a time of surging energy demand due to AI, data infrastructure, as well as climate change-induced move away from fossil fuels. The picture is best exemplified by the description of China as the world's first state. Can you help us define an electrostate versus a petrostate? And elaborate on whether short and medium-term global energy demand can accommodate both approaches.
Well, Earl, thank you. Many thanks to Network 2020 for the invitation. And it is really a true treat and pleasure to be doing this with Bob and Francisco. It's a great question. And I take people back to Bob's comments because what he outlined in terms of looking at oil demand is very much in line with my own thinking. The state question is very interesting. Earl, you asked about energy demand, but when we're thinking about electricity and power demand, we're seeing global spike here in the United States. We're looking at definitely an increase in terms of demand for electricity, much of that being driven by data center development, AI, and just overall electrification. Your question about the electrostate is a very interesting one. The best way to define an electrostate is you either are the manufacturer of the technologies for electrification, and or you're also the consumer of the technologies building out electrification in your country. China is considered to be the archetype because they are both the manufacturer of a lot of the technologies for electrification, but they're also a big consumer. So China has electrified faster, added more electrification in its system faster than any other country in the world. And at the same time, they hold much of the manufacturing power because of the scale and the way that they've been able to bring down price across whether it be solar panels, wind technologies, batteries, electric vehicles, and so on and so forth, as well as significant nuclear build out. The difference between an electrostate and a petrostate, I think it's really important to recognize that even electrostates are still very dependent on hydrocarbons. So China remains the largest importer of oil, and that's not going to change very significantly, even while at the same time, they recognize their structural vulnerabilities as a very import-dependent country on fossil fuels. So to reduce some of the vulnerabilities, those risks, the build-out of electrification has been very important. And I actually want to highlight, because yesterday the New York Energy Forum did an event on China, and someone did this amazing presentation in terms of the work in this space. So I think the idea of being a full-fledged electrostate that has no longer depends on hydrocarbons, that's not really, but I think it's important to say that the electrostates that have had historic high dependency on imported fossil fuels also see build out of electrification as a way to lessen some of that import dependency. Petrostates, of course, Saudi Arabia, Russia, these are countries that have historically been very big producers of hydrocarbons, to largest in terms of oil production, but have also used oil for leverage in the United States. The United States is the largest producer of oil and natural gas and has been able to also bring that into U.S. statecraft and foreign policy. I share with my students, it's only been 10 years that the United States has been exporting liquefied natural gas, but today we are the largest exporter of LNG in the world. 2023, we surpassed Qatar. So I think what we're seeing is this very interesting global picture of large-scale electrification in terms of demand for electrification in conjunction with increases in hydrocarbon demand.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. Francisco, we were talking about this earlier. This is the first time a president has not mentioned China several decades. I wanted to come to you with respect to looking at events in Venezuela. How are global rivals like China and Russia adjusting their energy and geopolitical strategies in response to pressure in their traditional strategic energy footholds in Latin America? Is this creating a new kind of energy Cold War?
Clearly part of the objective of the U.S. to take a much more active role in the region in terms of critical minerals, energy in general. South America mostly exports commodities to China and to other parts of Asia. And so the Chinese have become the main trading partners of most of the countries in the region, displacing the U.S. in the past couple of decades. Moving into Venezuela in particular, that has such a large resource base of oil and gas, has served as a demonstration effect over the rest of the region. China and Russia, the national companies of China and Russia, hold the largest reserves in terms of fields in Venezuela and paid for them. And now the U.S. is basically telling them, we are not going to give you a license, treasury license to export oil from Venezuela. China can buy oil from Venezuela, but at market prices and exported by licensed companies. That means that the Chinese and the Russians do not have any incentives to invest anymore in Venezuela in oil and gas. Venezuela still owes probably north of $15 billion to China, and they have to repay it with oil. And the U.S. is telling China, you can buy Venezuelan oil, but at market prices, you're going to get your debt repaid.
Great. Bob, last question goes to you from me. Given the pendulum swings in U.S. energy strategy from focusing on net zero and climate goals to a return to fossil fuel primacy, how do you think the U.S. private sector can position itself to remain competitive? And how does the Venezuelan oil factor in this?
Yeah, if you're in the U.S. private sector, whether you're a renewable investor or an oil and gas investor, whether you're in the electricity sector or the transportation sector or the airline, car manufacturing, the sector that makes the equipment that folks buy that use the energy, so long-lived equipment, what you crave more than anything is certainty. Certainty. We run on 4-year election cycles here. There's 3 years left to go in this administration. We may have a J.D. Vance. We may have a Gavin Newsom. Only thing we know for sure is our politics seem to be becoming more polarized. We can't even get permitting reform done, which is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition to enable us. There's a question I saw that came in about keeping up with China. We're never going to compete with China if we can't streamline the permitting of renewable and fossil fuel projects. Let the market win. So if you're industry, I think you're thinking of two things. First of all, you're probably pretty happy that we're moving away from this winner-picking, state-directed approach, which China continues to follow. And we can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A, what the pros and cons of that are. And more toward, as Caroline put it, more towards all of the above. And you're sort of grateful for that shift. And I think even the car companies and the renewable investors and the oil companies that are taking write-downs, those that have bet perhaps unwisely and excessively on this misplaced idea that net zero policy was going to ensure returns. Okay, we've all learned a lesson there. So there's this return to normality and kind of reason really. I think it's reason at the end of the day. And that's a good thing. But the risk is we will continue to see this wild volatility in what we call above ground risk, or mainly public policy. So if the Democrats come in and they say, well, President Trump seemed to have a pretty loose interpretation of emergency powers, and the courts backed him up. Why could not a Democratic president declare on the first day a climate emergency and restrict oil and gas exports right away? Those of us of a certain age, 10, 15, 20 years ago, we wouldn't be thinking of those as likely outcomes. We'd think that's extreme. But now can't rule it out. So that's really key for industry. Let's hope that we're not going to go back to this wishful thinking. Let's hope that government doesn't pick winners and losers, but let's hope it can function at least to do the minimum, like permitting reform, and stop this political volatility, which just makes their job hard enough of having to deploy capital to make choices on what to produce that last for decades, whether it's the equipment that uses energy or the energy itself. You got to stop the vacillation and the volatility, in my view.
Thank you. Francisco, here's a question for you. Is there medium-term potential to use the planned interoceanic LPG pipelines infrastructure in Panama for domestic downstream industries like petrochemicals or fertilizers by retaining some transited volumes to cut oil dependency?
Well, Panama has a very interesting position because, of course, a lot of not only the pipeline, but of course the tons of crude and products cross the Panama Canal. So they're trying to see if they can become a hub on the energy space. But I think it's relatively hard for that to happen. There have been a discussion over many years about this potential, but so far not many investments have materialized. So I think perhaps something could happen in this space, but not. I'm not thinking that it's going to be a dramatic investment.
Thank you. Carolyn, maybe this is a question that you'd like to take, or anyone in the panel. How do you see the long-term reaction by producers, investors, and consumers to this policy? How will it affect the U.S. dollar on the world stage?
Policy being which policy is it? I'm sorry, I'll go back to the question.
It says, how do you see the long-term reaction by producers, investors, and consumers to kind of oil policy writ large? How do you see us focusing more on kind of crude oil impacting the U.S. dollar on the world stage?
Yeah, I guess, my first response would be, I don't see so much sort of crude oil being the sort of what's driving sort of shifts in the dollar. I think there are a lot of other sort of policies and perceptions that are sort of driving some of the movement that we've seen, for example, over the last year in the dollar. We've seen some, I guess, a shift in de-dollarization to some degree, but a weakening of the dollar. But I see it less associated with crude per se, or U.S. sort of energy policy. I think I was one, and this was a kind of an interesting sort of comment to get Francisco and Bob's point. I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago, and one of the panelists actually spoke to sort of U.S. intervention, U.S. movement, for example, in Venezuela, where 20% of Venezuelan crude was traded in RMB, was not traded in the U.S. dollar. And the same thing in terms of Iran. And so when you start to then sort of see this sort of shift in Venezuelan oil and much more sort of U.S. involvement, that is re-dollarization, right? That is actually bringing more dollars into sort of oil trade. And again, we have I think the situation with Iran is is in play. I think Bob can definitely sort of speak to that. But even I think as recently as yesterday, the Iranians are sort of talking about bringing the United States in more to sort of their financial sector, which would probably mean their sort of oil and gas sector, which could also mean that there would be sort of re-dollarization in that space. So I think that's kind of, how I sort of see it in terms of, but there's a lot of other sort of things that are going on that are impacting the dollar.
Thank you, Carolyn. Another question and Bob, this may be best positioned for you. While the U.S. government is now prioritizing cheaper fuel, many global companies and investors have already spent years committing to net zero and green energy targets. Does this new U.S. strategy create a conflict for the private sector, or can they find a way to make fossil fuels and green energy live together?
It's a great question. Everything about energy is big, right? It's some have estimated, if you look at turnover and number of people on the planet employed, finding, producing, refining, distributing, selling energy, it's one of the largest organized human activities on the planet. And therefore, our successes are big and transformative for society and living standards. I mean, again, going from that 5,000 years of horses to cars and steam engine. When you think about how we were able to lift ourselves from millennia of poverty and darkness and cold. Okay. So, and our failures are big. When we make mistakes, we make big mistakes too. Nothing small about energy. And I would say, again, the costly lesson that many investors, and that includes automakers who bet big on electric vehicle supply chains and are now taking write-downs. That includes oil and gas companies that diversified heavily into non-core activities, renewables, batteries, other things. You have to ask yourself, because a few years ago, everyone said, well, oil and gas are the stranded assets. So we have to feel sorry for and wonder about how hydrocarbon asset holders are going to cope with this new world of batteries and electrification. And now everything's sort of flipped. And now it's, well, wait a minute. Actually, the folks with the stranded assets are those who bet too aggressively. So we're learning a very costly lesson. And but I think, can they live together? Yes. I mean, ultimately, you have to be optimistic about humans' abilities to employ their reason and intelligence to solve problems. And an ongoing problem we have, and which is essential for our living standards, is how to assure affordable flows of secure, reliable, and clean energy. Externalities are important. We can't afford to choke or die or imbibe chemicals that kill us, and we don't want to take risks with the planet that are excessive. We have to deal with externalities. So I hope what we do is after we move a few years from where we are now, we'll look back and we'll see this sort of, it's almost like a car with a drunk driver where it swerved to one side of the road and then swerved to the other. And I think, and I hope, and I'm confident that after swerving and incurring the costs of that and seeing the downsides of it, we'll get back to the middle of the road and say, okay, let's not be abrupt. Let's be realistic. Let's not thwart or hobble energy and resource, but let's not allow wishful thinking or radicalism to affect our energy, because when we do so, it only leads to costs and losses, again, on a big scale, because nothing about energy is small.
I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the extension of many of these coal power plants. And that I agree with Bob, is that coal will continue to be part of the U.S. baseload power system. But I think we cannot ignore the emissions and the air, the air quality issues associated with them.
Noted. Thank you, Carolyn. Francisco, this one is for you. How would the removal of Maduro through external intervention affect Venezuela's credibility with foreign investors? And would regime change alone be enough to reduce above ground risk and attract large scale FDI, given the country's history of expropriation and institutional weakness?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And no doubt, I mean, it's not just Venezuela, but the region in general. Latin America has had a history of reneging on oil deals. One of the sort of sad pieces of information that I teach in my class is that there are countries like Venezuela, Ecuador, and Argentina, and Bolivia, in which throughout the history of the oil sector, no contract has survived their full length without either forceful renegotiation, expropriation, nationalization, etc. Venezuela is, of course, a prominent case of that. And that, of course, also produces the hesitation in companies like Exxon of going back to Venezuela. And the most successful countries in the region currently, which are Brazil and Guyana. Of course, Guyana is a little bit early to tell because they are just a new producer, and so far they have done well in terms of not rocking the boat. In terms of there have been pressures to renegotiate contracts, but they have been careful with that. But Brazil has built a significant institutionality in order to create credibility for long-term investments, by having an independent regulatory agency, listed national company, etc. And they have a pretty good bureaucracy compared to other countries. So Venezuela will need to build institutions and political consensus to open up the oil sector among different political factions in order for this to be a durable oil opening, because no doubt that Venezuela requires massive foreign investment. The national company is completely destroyed. It's going to play a much smaller role in the future. In fact, it might become something akin to the Nigerian national company, meaning a company that only gives contracts to everyone else to produce and rather than produce themselves. So there are a lot of things to align before significant investment happen. It's just not this cosmetic change for now. Having said that, as I mentioned, I think that for incumbents, the change in the law has been very useful, and similarly, it might bring some short cycle investment.
Okay, great. Question for, once again, anyone in the panel. What do you think the keys are for U.S. investors to get comfortable with investing in domestic lithium battery supply chain? The importance of lithium as the new oil seems to be understood, but there is a fundamental gap in terms of where private investment capital is flowing into the industry. Who would like to take that one?
I'm happy to start, and then Francisco and Bob, please jump in. Francisco noted, the problem is the United States actually used to do a fair amount of mining, right? Many of those mines were sort of shut down in the 80s and the early 90s, mostly due to sort of a new environmental regulations, the Clean Water, Clean Air Act, and the like. And that sort of takes us back to those new dependencies, right? Or sort of ongoing dependencies, and critical minerals, of course, of the last few years is now headline news. It's like many people are talking about, where we are in terms of, demand for these minerals and metals, and that, the United States doesn't necessarily have a very sort of strong sort of mining ecosystem. And now we are sort of seeking to sort of build that either both domestically as well as sort of friendshoring and the like. And we've even seen the Vault program and Forge just in the last 2 weeks that has been announced from the U.S. government to kind of build a sort of a critical reserve, right? A stockpile of critical. So for lithium, I think the one lithium mine that is in the United States is in Nevada. Again, important for batteries, important for, I think, again, we've seen sort of a retreat a little bit away sort of from EVs in the United States, but I think across many different critical technologies, especially in the, defense sphere, as well as for in data centers, so for example, construction and the like, it's important. So I think this is it's an important area in terms of U.S. national security, in terms of its sort of where we've seen some choke points along the supply chain.
Absolutely. Well, it's exactly 1 p.m. and I want to be respectful of our speakers' times, but this has been a fascinating discussion. I think I could have gone on for several hours talking about these issues, but Francisco, Carolyn, Robert, thank you so much for your time. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.